You may have heard about the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, the organization that gave the world Hamas, and its role in fomenting violence, terrorism, and war in the Middle East, as they did on October 7th, and the war that followed. But did you know that it is not only also active in North America, but is helping anti-Semitism take root in Canada with not merely the acquiescence of the Canadian government, but also with funding from Ottawa? And that such activities are, along with funding from the usual Islamist suspects in Qatar and a network with ties to Iran, China, and Russia, America's ally to the north is becoming a hub for extremism that is influencing what is happening in the United States. Next, on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into the Muslim Brotherhood's efforts to establish a beachhead in North America. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an interesting conversation for you with scholar Charles Asher Small of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy about the surge in Jew hatred around the globe, and in particular what the Muslim Brotherhood is doing in North America. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Since the Hamas-led Palestinian Arab assault on southern Israeli communities on October 7, 2023, we've witnessed a surge of anti-Semitism across the globe. That has been made obvious in the enormous increase in attacks on Jews, as well as the demonstrations on the streets of cities and encampments on college campuses populated by mobs chanting for Israel's destruction and for terrorism against Jews. Much of the debate about this has centered on the complicity of universities as they tolerated and encouraged the targeting of Jews in ways that they would never accept if other minorities were the victims. We've also debated President Donald Trump's efforts to punish and defund institutions that have behaved in this manner. But too little attention has been devoted to the way foreign funders and activists have helped direct these efforts. And almost no one in the media, or even among those groups whose job it is to defend against Jew hatred, has been alert to the way that the group has gave birth to Hamas, has established a beachhead in North America. Some people know that the Muslim Brotherhood, the ideological force between modern Islamist terror and indoctrination, sought to take over Egypt and is sponsored by Qatar. But how many of us understand how deep it has planted its roots in Canada? A new report by the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism, or ISGAP, has brought to light the serious problem of Muslim Brotherhood infiltration in Canada, and its findings are as shocking as they are serious in terms of the extent of the group's impact on academia, civil society, and even the politics of America's northern neighbor, trading partner, and ally. It raises questions not just about the safety of the Jewish community in Canada, but also about its vulnerability to terrorism and its ability to sustain its democratic traditions. With the Muslim Brotherhood ensconced on the other side of the world's longest undefended border, it's inevitable that this is going to have an impact on the United States too. So we're fortunate to have with us today the director of ISGAP to speak about this study, as well as the global surge of anti-Semitism elsewhere. Charles Asher Small is the founding director and president of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, or ISGAP. He also serves as the director of the ISGAP Wolf Institute Fellowship Training Program in Critical and Contemporary Anti-Semitism Studies, Discrimination, and Human Rights, and is a research fellow at St. Edmund's College at the University of Cambridge in Britain. Additionally, he is the director of a fellowship training program in Critical Contemporary Anti-Semitism Studies at Tel Aviv University. He also established the ISGAP Oxford Summer Institute in Critical Anti-Semitism Studies at the University of Oxford in Britain, which has since graduated more than 600 scholars and residents from 48 countries and over 190 institutions worldwide. Previously, he was the founding director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, the first such research center on anti-Semitism at a North American university. He's the author of several books and articles, including the 5-volume Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity. Charles Asher Small, welcome to Think Twice.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here with you.
Well, thank you. Charles, thanks so much for joining us, taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about the recent report issued by ISGAP about anti-Semitism, and in particular, the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. When we think of the Brotherhood, we think of riots and terrorism in Egypt and also of Qatar, which hosts its leaders and funds its activities. But Canada? So first tell us, what is the Muslim Brotherhood and what is it doing in Canada, of all places?
Right. So, as you said, ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, just recently released a report on the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. It's our 15th report since October the 7th on dealing with issues in the Muslim Brotherhood. So basically, the Brotherhood is a reactionary social movement that started about 100 years ago in Egypt. And it basically takes the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the words and ideas that literally led to the Holocaust. As Professor Elie Wiesel says, that the Holocaust didn't begin with the railroad tracks and the crematoriums. It began with words and ideas. And they literally took the words and ideas that led to the Holocaust and fused it with a very reactionary form of Islam, a perversion of Islam, and created this social movement that has impacted the Islamic world and I think more recently Western Europe and North America. Their goal in the preachings of Yosef Qaradawi, the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood, throughout his entire life, he preached that the true believer, the true Muslim, is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. This is a core element of their ideology. It's the raison d'etre of their ideology. It's not the radical wing or the military wing. It's a core element of their ideology. Their goal is to murder Jews and destroy the state of Israel, the little Satan, and then to use anti-Semitism to fragment and weaken the great Satan, the United States, and other Western democratic countries. So in this series, we've been mapping the impact of the Brotherhood in American society. We've expanded our research into Canada and more recently into the United Kingdom, South Africa, and Australia. And in our first report after October the 7th, we did a report called The Network of Hate, looking at how the Muslim Brotherhood is connected to the Qatari regime and how the Qatari regime is using soft power to influence American society, Canada, and other countries. And what's unique about Canada, this network of hate, is that it's basically a center for money laundering and entryism of the Brotherhood into North American society, a very important part of the world. It's on the border of the United States, a strategic space of great importance to the Brotherhood ideology and their strategic goals.
Now, we've seen the creation of this bizarre red-green alliance of Marxists and Islamists in Europe, and to a lesser extent in America and college campuses. But your report details how extensive this is in Canada. It raises the question as to what is more important in pro-Hamas and anti-Israel activism, both in Canada and the United States. The leftist doctrines that mainstream anti-Semitism, like critical race theory, intersectionality, and settler colonialism, which sort of have become accepted doctrine throughout academia, or foreign influences like the Brotherhood and money from Qatar. What's, obviously maybe the answer is both, but what is playing the biggest role right now?
Great question. And I think both are very important issues in this explosion of anti-Semitism globally in the United States, in Canada, and other Western countries. And I think this Red-Green Alliance really goes back approximately 40 years ago, when the Muslim Brotherhood, first through the Saudis and now more recently through the Qataris, made a concerted effort to influence Western society and choosing academia as a key point to influence society. Universities, higher education is perhaps the most important institution in our society, in our democracy. It's where young people literally go to learn how to be citizens. And if you alter the education, if you change the discourse, you really change the future of society. This is where young journalists and professors and captains of industry, political leaders go to and are socialized. So if you influence it there, you influence society. And I think we learned from history, from the Iranian revolutionary regime to the Chinese communist revolution, that higher education, the university space, is very important for revolutionary thought. So by funding the universities, in our research, we found, for example, over $100 billion of funding going to American universities from the Qataris. And I should say to your listeners, the Qatari regime has a bay'ah. In Islam, a bay'ah is a spiritual oath. And they have a spiritual oath to the Muslim Brotherhood. They follow the religious edicts, rulings, and fatwas of the Brotherhood. And by funding, Qatar is the largest donor to American higher education than any other country in the world. And what's unique, it's a tiny country of less than 350,000 citizens. And they're giving more money to American higher education than any other country in the world, more than Canada, France, Germany, and other, Britain and other allies of the United States. So this in itself should raise suspicions. And the fact that this tiny country is giving so much and influencing, using soft power to influence our education, is so important. And we argue in our reports that it goes from the classroom to the encampments to our streets. And the works of Edward Said, for example, and other sort of post-colonial anti-Semitic thinkers, we've kind of accepted these type of intellectuals and scholars in these spaces for 40 years. And we should not be surprised that all this money and the shifting discourse is having an impact on our society. So the Brotherhood, on one hand, wants to destroy the West, wants to destroy the United States, and they want to destroy the state and other countries in the region and replace it with a caliphate. And then on the other hand, the postmodernists, Edward Said, Michel Foucault, the so-called progressive postmodern intellectuals, they're also committed to weakening Western hegemony or Western power in the world, specifically in spaces of peoples that were once colonized. They see Western policy and American policy as sort of neo-imperialism, and they want to end that. So the radical secular left combined with the radical Islamists have, it's a strange arrangement. They have nothing much in common except for the desire to weaken Western hegemony and to replace, the state with a caliphate on the one hand, and on the other hand, set free all those who have been colonized. And in these people's imagination on the left, Israel is the last vestige of sort of the British American imperialism. It's a vestige of that era that needs to be abolished.
Yeah, so they come together, as is often the case with different kinds of people. They come together over anti-Semitism. Let me stop for a moment. I want to get back into some of these issues about, academia and the progressives' long march through our institutions. But let's spend a moment on Qatar. Qatar's really nefarious role in funding extremism around the world, madrasas, Middle East studies, institutes and major universities has been well known, but they're still being treated, certainly by the Trump administration, which is otherwise very pro-Israel and very much against anti-Semitism, as as an ally. There is a U.S. naval base there. How have they been able to sort of play both ends against the middle, to still be close to Iran, to be funding, not merely funding the Muslim Brotherhood, but being, directed by it in some ways, and playing such an awful role around the world, and yet still being treated by the United States and other world governments as a very helpful player on the world stage?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question. And I think that at one level, you have to give the Qataris a lot of credit for being so, strategic and crafty in their foreign policy, and they speak out of not two sides of their mouth, they speak out of many sides of their mouth. So on the one hand, they have a spiritual oath to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is committed to destroying Western democratic countries, including the United States. They have good relations with Hamas. What's left of the Hamas leadership is still housed in Qatar. The spiritual leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood are also in Qatar. Qatar has good relations with the Iranian revolutionary regime, with the Taliban and other Islamists on the one hand, and as you said, on the other hand, they host one of the most important military bases of the United States in that part of the world. They invest a lot of money into our economies, into American economy, Canadian economy, and Western Europe.
Yeah, a certain real estate investment involving Mr. Witkoff certainly was a very good investment as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what's also interesting, Stephen Schwartzman was one of the board of directors on the Qatari Foundation. And if you look at the investments of the Qatari Foundation, which plays with assets up to $1 trillion, they really follow the financial advice and expertise of Stephen Schwartzman. He's no longer on the board, but has very good relations with the regime, as do other, Western business leaders, and actually quite a few business leaders in our own community, which is interesting. And yes, they have friends on the Democratic side of the aisle and also on the Republican side of the aisle. And when the Trump administration visited Doha recently, I guess 6 to 8 weeks ago, when President Trump was offered the plane, there's a lot of business deals going on with members of the Trump family and other prominent business people. So those incentives are very much, they're attractive to our business community and our political leaders. And they're doing the same in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in France, and they're really normalizing, I think, a very dangerous anti-democratic worldview. So on the one hand, they're doing business deals in real estate, as you said. They're buying cultural institutions. They're buying up media from CNN. The Wall Street Journal, of all places, just carried a big ads for them a few days ago. The Washington Post, another, very important media of record, has good relations with the Qataris. So on the one hand, they're using soft power, up to $1 trillion in assets, to really buy favor from Western leaders. What was fascinating, there was recently a report by the Minister of Interior of France about the entryism of the Muslim Brotherhood into French society and the strategic threat it poses to the internal stability of France. Recently, when the Paris Saint-Germain won the European football match, the soccer tournament, they were flown back to Paris on a Qatari Airways jet. All the players were wearing Qatar Airlines T-shirts. President Macron thanked the Qataris for their investment in French, business and the economy and into football. Thanked them 3 times in their acceptance speech. And at the same time, on the street, there were young, disenfranchised Muslims in the streets of Paris and other leading cities, basically having a mini intifada for several days with automatic weapons in the streets, and a lot of damage to property, and a lot of physical attacks and even death. So they're operating at the high level of culture, and then our streets are being, overrun in major Western European democratic cities, and we begin to see the same trends happening in Canada, just north of the border.
Now, let me get back to your report, which spoke about the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada, and it talks about Canadian Muslim groups. We know in the United States, the leading Muslim group, Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE, was founded as a front for Hamas, for fundraisers for Hamas. The Canadian groups, are they like CARE, pretending to be civil rights groups while they're fronts for terrorist supporters? What is going on there?
Absolutely, it's very similar. So there was CARE Canada that was recently renamed, as another acronym, but the same type of actors with the same type of philosophy have been acting there in the Muslim Association of Canada and other prominent organizations. You have kind of Islamist tendencies and you know, contacts and the same people operating in similar community organizations connected to CARE in the United States and other Islamist organizations. You also have, I think, the advancement of the whole notion of Islamophobia. So unlike the United States, which has strong protection for freedom of speech with the First Amendment, in Canada, there's freedom of speech for sure, but there's also notions of hate legislation, hate speech. So there's some limitations against kind of violent speech that's targeted to Canadian citizens. So these
this is they don't have a First Amendment in Canada. Actually,
correct.
neither in Israel too or Britain. But this is important. This is an important distinction here.
Correct. So they're using the existing political culture and legal culture to promote notions of Islamophobia. So if you, for example, increasingly there's tremendous amount of fear in Canada in the Canadian Jewish community and I'd say in the human rights community, that when you speak out about, against some of these groups and criticize them and criticize the Muslim Brotherhood, you're being targeted and defined as Islamophobic, which is problematic in the Canadian political context. So I find there's a lot of fear. I was, for the record, I was born in Montreal. I did my doctorate degree on issues of multiculturalism. I think Canada, is a fine democratic, social democratic country with, an amazing, vibrant society that's contributed much to notions of citizenship and integration. It has achieved a lot, but I'd say that its democratic culture is really increasingly under threat in Canada because of this type of discourse and the fear that these groups are imposing. And we all, in our report, we actually trace funds coming directly from Yosef Kawadawi into community organizations, into mosques, political leaders from all three of the major political parties thanking Yosef Kawadawi and Muslim Brotherhood affiliated entities and organizations in Qatar for their investment and donations to their community. So this is, I think, really a serious threat to Canadian society, and I think Americans who often don't pay too much attention to to issues north of the border should become increasingly concerned, because I think the Brotherhood has entered into Canadian society much like French society, and there's a sense of entryism into political culture, into very important institutions, including the parliament and provincial legislation, and into the business community. And we see money laundering going into the United States from Canada. We see radical Islamists entering the United States from Canada. So I think that more than fentanyl, this is really a threat to the United States and to our neighbor to the north. We need a strong democratic Canada. And I think this should be very much on the minds of people who care about anti-Semitism and the health of the Canadian democracy north of the border.
I think the point here to make is that much of what is labeled Islamophobia, certainly in the United States, but more dangerously in Canada, where it can be rendered illegal, are basically people calling out Muslim groups like these Muslim Brotherhood fronts for their anti-Semitism. I mean, that, basically accountability for anti-Semitism is Islamophobia in the legal network in Canada. That hasn't happened in the United States because there are more free speech protections. But
Yeah.
this is a real disconnect, isn't it?
Absolutely. So I was saying I'm originally from Montreal, and I was there for the Seders. And the second Seder was at my sister's house. And my grandparents were friends with a group of people who migrated or lived in Montreal. And my parents were friends with the children of this group. I was friends with many of the grandchildren of this group, and my nephews are friends with the great-grandchildren of this community. And this is a group of Jewish people that are very proud of their heritage. They're practicing Jews. They're very proud. They're all Zionists. Canadian Jews, I think, are a little bit more traditional in general than American Jews in some sense. And I was sitting around the Passover table listening to the conversation And I literally, I'm not exaggerating, I did not recognize the city, the community, the conversation at the table. I didn't recognize where I was from. We have people taking mezuzahs off their door, not because they're ashamed to be Jewish, but they don't feel safe to have their mezuzahs there. Vandalism, people going through Jewish communities, playing Arabic music very loud, taking pictures of homes with mezuzahs, violence in the streets, even, tremendous amount of protests, violence, intimidation, that in some cases in Montreal and Toronto, the police don't seem to be so supportive of the Jewish community. They seem to be becoming more aligned with the protesters. So real fear, people discussing whether they should leave to the United States or to Israel. It's really a crisis there.
Hmm. Now, one of the things your report detailed was the fact that the Canadian government is funding Muslim Brotherhood fronts and activities. Tell us how that happened and what impact has this had?
Yeah, so we found in our report that there's some ministries that have been funding these community organizations. I think what's happened in Canada, and it's certainly happening in France to a significant extent, but very much also in the United Kingdom. Um, the Muslim Brotherhood front organizations portray themselves as authentic Muslims, the authentic voice of the Muslim community, and marginalize those who are not so religious or identified with the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. These are often British or French or Canadian Muslim citizens who just want to get on with their lives and be good citizens and good neighbors. So there's sort of the radicalization of communal organizations, and the fact that Canada is a multicultural society where the government often funds community organizations and community activities. The Brotherhood affiliated organizations have sort of inserted themselves and have managed to portray themselves as the authentic leaders of the community, and in that sense then are positioned well to receive federal funding for various programs, and that's happening at a significant rate.
Hmm. How are they using this influence and money? We've spoken about Qatar, which funds Muslim madrasas as well as Middle East studies departments in the U.S. How is this radicalizing Canadian society by mainstreaming, such radical groups with these very, anachronistic ideas about society in general, but specifically their hatred for Jews?
Yeah.
How is this filtered into the rest of Canadian society?
So you have, especially after October 7th, this explosion of anti-Semitism. Some Muslim organizations have become very active against Israel and even local Jewish communities. We have mosques that have been radicalized by funding from Qatar and other nefarious sources. So you have it kind of at a community level, the radicalization of the Muslim community. But as you were saying earlier, in this sort of red-green alliance, you also have, as in the United States, but I think it's maybe more advanced in Canada, you have groups like Students for Justice in Palestine that come out of AMP, the American Muslims for Palestine, which are directly connected to the Muslim Brotherhood and its ideology. So SJP has been operating on campus, radicalizing students, and after October the 7th, they were also adopting the toolkit that said they were not just supporting Hamas, but they were part of the resistance. And this radicalization, as I said earlier, has gone from the classroom. You have professors for many years teaching this stuff. You have SJP, or being the sort of the shock troops, the political activists on campus. Then they organize the encampments and start to shift the political culture or consolidate the political culture on campus, which demonizes Zionism and Israel and the Jewish people. And it sort of legitimizes this sort of violence, rhetoric and violence against the Jewish community. And in Montreal and Toronto, as in Brooklyn and Los Angeles, you have some of the people going from the campuses now protesting in front of yeshivas and synagogues, probing the physical security of communities, seeing how the security within the synagogues and institutions will respond, how quickly the police will respond. And we know from police forces and experts on counterterrorism that this is very specific sort of probing of potentially laying the groundwork for acts of terror. So it's very dangerous, and there is a radicalization. And then you have, mass protests and young people chanting now for nearly 2 years really horrible things about Jews, which further radicalizes them and enters into their psyche. So, and as you know, as well as I do, this anti-Semitism from the classroom to the encampment to the streets has now entered into popular culture with, Bob Vylan, not Bob Dylan, but Bob Vylan at the popular music festival in the UK, calling for death for the IDF. And we can see with social media, within days, this has become a chant throughout the world. So it's really the globalization of anti-Semitism has reached a very high level. And we show in our 15 reports that, this has been a well-developed strategic plan to focus on destroying the little Satan in the kinetic war, and then using anti-Semitism to fragment American society and Western democratic societies, to weaken it, to destroy that as well. And I think we also have to understand that this is the eighth or ninth front in this war. We have kinetic warfare against Israel from Hamas in Gaza, from Lebanon, potentially also now from the West Bank, because Hamas is actually quite popular there. We had Syria, Iran, the Houthis in Yemen. So you have this sort of kinetic warfare, but I think an important part of the strategic goals of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Qataris is the elimination of Israel and the attack on Jews. And this investment of up to $100 billion that we located in our research just in the United States has been a strategic goal to really weaken the West and really, through anti-Semitism, through the demonization of American, Canadian, British, and French Jews. And it's coming to fruition. And as Elie Wiesel says and taught, that anti-Semitism may begin with the Jewish people, but it never ends with the Jewish people. And I think what's happening must be understood as an early warning system for an attack on our democratic society. This is an attack on our society and an attack on the stability of our society. So this is really not just a Jewish problem or an Israeli problem. It's an American problem. It's a Canadian problem. It's a problem for democracies around the world.
Yeah. Now, one of the points of contention in the United States, certainly with the Trump administration's focus on anti-Semitism, has been the role of foreign students as well as foreign funding. How much of that is really a factor, both in the United States and Canada, with foreign students helping to lead not merely demonstrations, but these groups targeting Jews, fronting for, Muslim Brotherhood and pro-Hamas activism, and certainly Trump is trying to close it off. What's the situation in Canada, and how do you see foreign students playing in this issue?
So that's a very important point. I think so. Foreign students, as everybody knows, pay higher tuition fees, and make up a considerable part of universities' budget. So it's
certainly among elite universities in the United States, it's in a shockingly large number of shockingly large percentage of the student body is now foreign. So I don't want to interrupt you, but it's really a major factor.
Absolutely. And I think there's an interesting case in Canada. The Canadian government, this is probably about 2.5 years ago, had a trade conflict with the Saudis. And Prime Minister Trudeau at the time warned the Saudis that if this conflict wasn't resolved, he was going to have sanctions against the Saudis, and he was going to remove the foreign students from the United States, from Canadian universities. And when he received word from the Canadian universities at the magnitude of this sanctions, within hours he caved, and he didn't want to stop the Saudi students and their funding going to the university. So it's an important piece of it.
That really illustrates why this is a choke point and why they are so worried about Trump cutting it off.
Absolutely. And at the hearings about 3 weeks ago in Washington, the president of Georgetown, Berkeley, and CUNY were being interviewed at the hearing, And we had just done a report on Georgetown University, and we found over $1 billion of Qatari money, Muslim Brotherhood money, going to Georgetown. And as everybody knows, Georgetown has one of the most important diplomatic training programs in the United States, if not the world. So by Muslim Brotherhood scholars, influenced scholars, training future diplomats and State Department officials and security officials, it's very damaging. And so, the Qataris have funded various research centers at Georgetown, now in its second generation, and it's really a hub of the academic front of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Professors Esposito and other prominent scholars have been training academics and inculcating them in anti-Semitic and anti-American ideologies. Professor Brown was just reprimanded because during the 12-day war, he actually tweeted something out about hoping that there'd be an Iranian attack on American spaces in Qatar. So he was reprimanded. But the Georgetown University gave a special medal of honor to Sheikh Musa, who is the head of the Qatari Foundation, and she supports Hamas. She was supporting the leaders of Hamas, and she was saying that despite the victory of the Israelis in the Gaza war, the coming defeat of Hamas, that the spirit of Hamas will live on forever. And he was asked, like, why would you give Sheikh Musa such a high honor? And the president of Georgetown said, well, she helps children and she does great work. And he was pressed at the hearing and said, but she calls for the elimination of the state of Israel. And is that a Georgetown value? And he wouldn't yield, and he supported the awarding of the medal of a woman who literally calls for the end of Israel and the success and triumph of Hamas over the Jewish people. So it's extraordinary. And this stands. And he was unabashed and honest, but they're taking billions of dollars from the Qataris and supporting people who call for the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews. And it's extraordinary. And for money, the leaders of many universities in North America will set aside their democratic values and take the money. It's alarming. It's especially alarming that it's taking place at universities that have such I think a profoundly important role and responsibility to train the next generation of democratic-minded citizens. So it's really an affront and a threat to our democracy. And we also found in another report at Brown University, there's a program called the Choices Program that Omar Bartov, the famous Holocaust studies professor, plays a key role.
Who's made a name for himself recently by using the New York Times to accuse Israel falsely of genocide.
Right. So, and he's, a prominent scholar, and he's Jewish and Israeli, so very problematic. It turns out that he plays a key role in the Choices Program that received $1 billion from the Qataris, and they create curriculum for over 8,000 schools across the United States for children from K through 12. And in the curriculum, they remove Jewish people and Christian people from the Middle East and espouse anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist and anti-Israeli propaganda that's now affecting our children in the United States. And when we published the report, and as great as ISGAP is, we don't have the largest following, but we started getting phone calls from parents, Jewish parents from around the country, from California, Michigan, Illinois, Rhode Island, Connecticut, saying that they've been taking their children out of schools and these are children, because they couldn't believe the level of anti-Semitism that they were being taught in the curriculum. So this is really an alarming situation that our community, and I think our security forces and our political leaders really need to understand the implications of. It's a real threat to our stability, to our security.
Yeah. You've mentioned about how it's a threat to democracy in Canada. And you gave us an example before about how it sort of influenced one decision by the former Canadian Prime Minister. But I guess my question is, how is this playing out in Canadian politics? Is somebody pushing back against this? is there basically no is there a constituency for saying enough or saying we have to stop this? Or is it just sort of everybody being, the sort of the stereotypical Canadian nice, and just letting it go? Because, obviously these Muslim Brotherhood fronts are getting a pass. They're not just getting a pass, they're getting funding. Is this a subject of debate, or is that debate out of bounds because of the fear of being called Islamophobic?
So the fear of being labeled Islamophobic is really instilling fear in the Jewish community. I had the honor of taking a report around Ottawa with Professor Irwin Cotler, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Professor of Human Rights Law, really a legend in Canada. And we took a report to various ministers in the federal government. We also met with leaders of security forces there. And it seemed to me that the security and some of the ministers were more open to what we were presenting. And I hope that this will be follow-up. There should be follow-up shortly. But we also took it to members of the Jewish community. And I have to say that my colleagues and I were really shocked and I'd say quite terrified of the response. I think the community, the leaders of the community care, but they're terrified of being labeled Islamophobic. Some organizations are being threatened with lawsuits, and there's a fear that they can lose their insurance policies and really go into a difficult time. So there's a sense of fear more than anything else. And the fact that ISGAP is based in the United States and we publish our material from the United States gives us some layer of protection, but we'll continue to speak out, truth to power, and hopefully it will cause some conversations in Canada that need to take place. Yeah, but I think,
if I can just interject, in the United States, obviously there's a debate about these issues, but clearly among Republicans and in the Trump administration, there is a constituency that says, we're against it. Is there any constituency, say, among conservatives who just lost an election in Canada, largely because of Trump,
exactly,
to be pushing back against it, or are they just going along with it too?
So I think now with the Carney administration, Carney was recently elected and joined Prime Minister Stammer and President Macron to welcome in the Palestinian state. I'm just sort of scratching my head, wondering who they're going to invite to Paris or London or Ottawa as the head of this Palestinian entity. It remains to be seen, what will this entity be? Where will the boundaries be? Who's going to run it? It's extraordinary. But I think they're pandering to the unrest in the streets of Britain and France and Canada. And there's a political climate now where I think they're desperately trying, by recognizing this impossible entity at this moment, that they'll placate some of their constituents. I think they're pandering to some of the organizations that we write about in our report in Canada and trying to have a little bit more, less resistance to their administrations by radical people on the radical left and the radical Islamists that are on the streets threatening people. So I think it's for internal consumption, but points to the fact that leading democratic countries, set aside, I guess, our political orientation and how we both, I know, care deeply about Israel, set that aside, and they're actually willing to recognize an entity that for all intents and purposes is being controlled significantly by Hamas, which is the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, that just, carry out some of the most brutal pogroms, in our history. So the most brutal, certainly since the Holocaust. We're at ISGAP in Oxford now running a summer institute. I just came from a lecture by Yifat Biton, who does a lot of work on legal issues about the rights of women and the sexual violence that was perpetrated against Israeli women during the October 7th pogrom. And it's just staggering, the silence of women organizations, international organizations, and organizations from democratic countries to this issue. So, people are turning a blind eye to and have, inappropriate criteria when it comes to Israeli and Jews compared to other people. There's sort of so yeah, it's troubling. And it really, at the end of the day, will harm democracies in the West if we placate this barbarism.
Now, you mentioned in passing before that because of this, Canada has become a hub for international money laundering.
Yes.
Explain more about that, and how connected is this to the actions of, rogue nations like Russia, China, and of course, Iran?
So it's a good question. So our second report that came out in November of 2023, we have a group of scholars who are experts on anti-Semitism, another group who are experts on radical Islam, and we work with some of the best experts on terror financing and forensic accounting. And the forensic accountants were incredible. They were the main impetus for this report. We look at issues of the sort of international network of up to $1 trillion being used for soft power. And in this international network, there's money coming from the UK into Canada and to the United States and then back again. And our forensic accountants show how Canada has really become a hub of money laundering. And once the money is laundered, it's then diffused into Canadian community organizations and universities and other entities. But a lot of money is also going into the United States and into the United Kingdom. And actually, we presented these findings to the U.S. Treasury, and they were, they thought the report was important, and they're concerned about what's happening north of the border. So this is an important part of this international network of money laundering and influence.
Now, we've detailed some of what's been going on in Canada, which you've explored in your report. Americans could say, well, that's Canada. The United States is different and has a very different government, especially right now, which is pushing back hard against anti-Semitism. But let's for a moment explore the impact of having, on the other side of what everybody likes to call the world's longest unguarded frontier or border between two countries, between Canada and the United States, of having, frankly, the Muslim Brotherhood having a beachhead in North America. How does that impact Americans? How does that impact, our lives and the way our institutions work?
So what we found, we work with experts of the Muslim Brotherhood, and through our research, what we found is perhaps the most infiltrated democratic country now appears to be Canada. And this should be alarming to Americans and, of course, to Canadians, because as you said, if there's a beachhead established by the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada, it's on, the longest unprotected, peaceful border in the world. There's money coming into the United States, which will affect the American society as well. And there's entryism. So there's entryism of money. There's entryism of people. There's been instances where actually terrorists have crossed the border from Canada into the United States. And we know that even in academia, doctoral students and professors will end up with a place at a good university in Canada, and soon after that enter into the United States and establish their career there and influence students and society in the United States. So this relatively open border, I think the society and the sort of social democracy of Canada is more conducive for the infiltration of the Brotherhood. And I think once this beachhead is established, it's definitely going to affect the United States. And I think, as I said earlier, much more damaging than fentanyl, as serious as fentanyl is, the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and its encroachment into Canadian society and its normalization in Canada is really a threat to the United States. And I think as Muslim Brotherhood entities gain strength in Canada, they are going to work with American entities and individuals and institutions and strengthen them in the United States. And, and I think Mamdani is also an expression of this sort of red-green alliance.
The Democratic nominee for mayor of New York. Yeah.
Absolutely. So he's legitimizing this Red-Green Alliance rhetoric. He's normalizing anti-Semitism, and he's normalizing the sort of soft power of Muslim Brotherhood ideology. He was one of the organizers of the SJP chapter at Bowdoin College. His father, a colleague of Rashid Khalili, were instrumental in establishing the encampments. They were teaching this worldview, if I could put it this way, for decades at Columbia University, radicalizing students, legitimizing and normalizing genocidal, and I'm choosing my words carefully, genocidal education in some of the best universities in our country. And and apropos of that, I'll just say, I think it was around the 23rd of October, 2023, I went to a teach-in at Columbia University in the School of Social Work. And I'll never forget this experience as long as I live. There were professors of social theory, of philosophy, of gender studies, and doctoral students calling for the elimination of Israel, the elimination of the occupation by any means necessary. And they were arguing that the violence against Jewish men and women in the occupied entity would only end when the occupation ends, when the Jews are removed from the land. And they said anybody who stands in the way of this struggle, this resistance, including Americans, need to be met with resistance by any means necessary. So they were using the most sophisticated intellectual discourse of social theory, philosophy, gender studies, and these are some of the most, well-educated professors and doctoral students at one of the best universities in the world, using sophisticated intellectual arguments to call not just for the elimination of the state of Israel, but for violence against their colleagues, professors, students, and staff members who happen to be Jewish at Columbia. It was astounding. So this intellectual normalization and legitimization of calling for the extermination of Israelis, the doing away with the Israeli state, and violence against Jews is extraordinary. So the SJP, the Mamdanis, his father, Saeed, this has all laid the groundwork for this type of political discourse that is now being normalized. And I think if Mamdani wins the mayoral election, he will not only affect the discourse in New York, he'll have a national, if not an international platform that will amplify and normalize this horrible anti-Semitism and ultimately anti-democratic worldview.
Yeah. What you've just stated, it's a great example of something that happened at Columbia, why Columbia needs to be cleaned up, why the pushback against leading universities happened, and that's what the Trump administration has been trying to do, to punish and defund, or at least force them by a settlement to change their policies that tolerated and encouraged anti-Semitism. But what are your policy recommendations in general about Canada and the United States for dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood and everything that's in your report?
So on two levels, I think universities or any entities receiving foreign funding, there must be laws that are stringent laws that are actually enforced, that makes universities and other entities declare foreign funding and do it in a transparent manner. According to American law, donations of over $250,000, MOUs or contracts, the receiving entity, universities, are obligated to make it public. They're not, and these laws are not being enforced. So I think that's a very important issue that I think Canadians and Americans really need to enforce, the laws that exist and make them stronger. And I think on another level, on May the 14th, ISGAP held a small conference, or a one-day conference rather, in Washington in the Rayburn building in the Congress. And we had experts from the United States, from Canada, from Europe, from Iraq, from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, from North Africa, really experts on the Muslim Brotherhood. And we're calling for making the Muslim Brotherhood illegal in the United States. We're calling for the Brotherhood to be illegal, and any of these front organizations like CARE and other entities should be made illegal because they are undermining the democratic values of the United States. Their goal is to weaken and destroy it, and in the process, normalize anti-Semitism and violent anti-Semitism. So I think one of the things...
Do we do that by labeling them as, connected to terrorism?
Yeah, so I'm not a legal scholar, but some of the legal scholars are saying that this would be the way to do it. If we designate them as a terror organization, the Muslim Brotherhood is a terror organization. We've designated Hamas as a terror organization, which is an offshoot or a branch of the Brotherhood. And I think if the Brotherhood is defined as a terror organization in the United States, designated as a terror organization, then any individuals or entities dealing with with the Brotherhood would be violating American law. So
Right.
I think this is a very important step. There is bipartisan support for the first time. There's been attempts over the years to make the Brotherhood illegal. And now for the first time, there's Democrats and Republicans agreeing that this has to be done. Senator Cotton just called for a federal investigation into CARE and its association to the Brotherhood and terrorism. So there seems to be, after October 7th, people are more aware of who the Brotherhood is. And I think once people are aware, they're beginning to see its influence, and people are becoming increasingly concerned that this is not just a problem for the Middle East, but this is actually a problem for Americans and Canadians, for British, and for the French and other democratic countries.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Well, Charles, thanks so much for joining us today and for all of your insights. Tell us more about how our audience can find out more about ISGAP.
Okay, thank you. So ISGAP is the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP. And you're welcome to see our website at www.isgap.org. We also have a television show on JBS. David Harris, who's our vice chair, and I host a weekly show. Natan Sharansky is our chair, and we have 85 research fellows from around the world. We have a small entity in Cambridge University and now in France, and we're opening an INSS in a couple of weeks, the Institute for National Security Studies. So you're welcome to join our mailing list. We have a digital research center, so we have a lot of seminars and lectures and programs that you can take online as well.
Well, that's great. ISGAP is an important resource that is bringing more attention to a terrible problem that we should appreciate. And thanks for taking the time to join us. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us on any one of the various podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.